kid. This section isn't a charity daycare.
The words sliced through the first-class cabin of Skyward Airlines Flight 31 like a blade through Silk Officer Marcus Webb. Square-jawed and built like a wall of unearned authority, stood towering over Seat 1A, with his badge catching the afternoon light streaming through the aircraft windows. His voice carried that particular brand of certainty that came from 12 years of wielding power without consequence. He pointed at the young black girl sitting quietly by the window, as if she were an insect that had somehow crawled onto expensive velvet. "You heard me. Up and out. You're in the wrong section." Officer Webb didn't know it, but in exactly 14 minutes, one phone call would not only cancel this flight carrying 287 passengers, it would expose a 2-year discrimination scheme targeting minority travelers and cost Skyward Airlines $847 million in federal fines. Zara Johnson, 16, sat perfectly still in her window seat, her petite frame almost swallowed by the cream leather chair. Her dark eyes, intelligent and careful, met Webb's stare without flinching. She wore a soft grey cardigan over a white blouse, dark jeans and comfortable sneakers. Nothing flashy. Nothing that screamed wealth or privilege. Just a teenager traveling alone, carrying a worn leather portfolio that held sheet music and dreams. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the flush creeping up her neck. "I think there's been a mistake. This is my seat." Webb snorted, the sound echoing off the polished cabin walls. "Your seat, please." His voice rose, ensuring every passenger in first class could hear every word. "First class isn't a library lounge for wandering scholarship charities. What did you do? Just stroll in here hoping no one would question you?" He turned slightly, playing to his audience, the business travelers clutching their champagne glasses, the elderly couple in 3C who had stopped mid-conversation, the woman in 2B who was pretending to read her magazine but hanging on every word. Webb had perfected this performance over the years. Make it public, make it humiliating, make it stick. This is what happens when security gets too soft. He announced, his Chicago accent thick with disdain. "Anybody thinks they can play pretend up here?" Behind him, flight attendant Carmen Rodriguez stepped forward like an eager accomplice. At 42, Carmen had 15 years of experience with Skyward Airlines, and she wore her seniority like armor. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, her uniform pressed and spotless, but her smile held something cold underneath. "Sergeant Webb," she said, her tone dripping with polite cruelty. She boarded early, while staff were distracted during the cleaning rotation. "You know how certain passengers try to slip into premium cabins, hoping we won't challenge them?" The phrase "certain passengers" made the entire cabin flinch. Everyone knew exactly what she meant. Everyone felt the ugly weight of it settling over the expensive seats like toxic fog. Webb nodded slowly, savoring the moment. He lived for this, the authority, the attention, the power to decide who belonged where. "Exactly, Carmen. Always the same pattern. Quiet face, nervous hands, cheap bag." He gestured toward Zara's leather portfolio with disgust. "And what's this another prop? Don't tell me you're some prodigy traveling to a royal concert." Zara's fingers tightened on the armrest. The portfolio wasn't cheap. It had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of musicians. Inside were original compositions she'd spent months perfecting for her Juilliard audition. But she could see how Webb viewed it. Old, worn, not shiny enough for his idea of first-class worthy. "I'm going to an audition," she said quietly, the words almost lost in the cabin's thick air. Webb barked out a laugh that made several passengers wince. "An audition? In first class? That's adorable, sweetheart. Maybe save the fairy tales for coach where they belong." He leaned closer, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a whisper, but making sure the whole cabin heard every poisonous word. Let me guess. Daddy told you to dream big, huh? Well, this is real life, kid. Seats like this are earned, not wished into existence. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows caught the cheap metal of Webb's badge as he straightened up. He'd been with Chicago Transit Authority airport security for over a decade, but a recent complaint about excessive force had left him demoted and desperate to prove his vigilance. This girl, this quiet, dignified girl who refused to cower, represented everything that threatened his fragile sense of control. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their leather seats. The businessman in 4A cleared his throat but said nothing. The mother, traveling with her teenage daughter in 5B, clutched her pearls but looked away. The elderly man in 2C folded his newspaper and stared out the window. They all sensed something ugly unfolding, but nobody wanted to get involved. Carmen Rodriguez folded her arms across her chest, the gesture making her appear larger, more threatening. She refused to show ID when I first asked. During boarding, she added, piling lie upon lie with practiced ease. I wasn't refusing. Zara whispered, her voice barely audible above the cabin's air circulation. You startled me when you approached, and then you walked away before I could respond. Webb cut her off with a sharp gesture. Enough. His voice cracked like a whip. I already know what's going on here. You don't belong here. And deep down you know it. He reached toward her arm, the movement deliberate and intimidating. Zara recoiled instinctively, pulling back into her seat. The motion was natural protective, but Webb's eyes flashed with something ugly. Oh, resisting now. Interesting. His voice carried a note of satisfaction, as if her perfectly reasonable response had just proven his point. Guilty conscience, maybe? He raised his voice again, ensuring his words carried to every corner of the first-class cabin. Passengers, please note that this individual is being removed for security inconsistencies and suspicious behavior. Gasps rippled through the cabin like a stone dropped in still water. In seat 3B, travel blogger Sarah Mitchell looked up from her phone, her Instagram-trained instincts immediately recognizing drama worth documenting. 2 rows behind her, documentary filmmaker James Park shifted in his seat, his hand moving unconsciously toward his camera bag. Zara felt her throat tighten, emotion threatening to spill over. But in her mind, she heard her father's voice, calm and steady, as always. Stay calm, baby girl. Always stay calm. Dignity first. Let them show you who they are, but never let them change who you are. Webb leaned in again, his face now inches from hers, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried throughout the cabin. Look at me when I'm talking to you, girl. Or is eye contact too much responsibility for someone like you? The words hit like physical blows. Someone like you. The phrase hung in the air, toxic and unmistakable in its meaning. Around the cabin, passengers sat frozen, witnessing something they knew was wrong, but feeling powerless to stop. But within Zara's chest, something quiet and powerful began to rise. A memory from her childhood, sitting on her grandmother's piano bench, learning not just music, but life. The verse her grandmother had taught her for moments exactly like this one, when the world tried to make her small. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Psalm 27. She breathed in slowly, deeply, letting the words fill her lungs and steady her heartbeat. Webb mistook her composure for defiance, her dignity for insolence. You think staying quiet makes you innocent, he snarled. It just makes you look rehearsed. I've seen this scam 100 times. Kids with fake passes claiming they're authorized, hoping no one bothers to check properly. He turned back to Carmen, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. Flight crew should really stop letting charity cases wander up here. Makes the whole section look cheap, don't you think? The insult landed like a slap. Zara's breath caught in her throat. her chest tightening not from fear anymore, but from humiliation burning into her skin like fire. Her fingers moved toward her phone, trembling slightly. "I need to call my father," she said quietly. Webb rolled his eyes dramatically, the gesture so exaggerated it would have been comical if the situation weren't so ugly. "Oh, perfect. Here comes the imaginary millionaire guardian angel. Call whoever you want, princess. When I'm done here, you'll be walking off this plane with security escorts and a nice little note in our travel blacklist system." Carmen added with a smirk that didn't reach her eyes, "Maybe Daddy can buy you a real seat next time." Around them, 42 passengers sat in their premium leather seats, witnessing an injustice they would never forget. Most would later admit they knew something was wrong from the very beginning. They could feel the wrongness of it settling over the cabin like smoke. But in that moment, paralyzed by discomfort and social conditioning, they simply watched. None of them had any idea that the phone call Zara was about to make would change everything, not just for her, not just for this flight, but for the entire airline industry. In exactly 11 minutes, Officer Marcus Webb's world would collapse. Carmen Rodriguez's 15-year career would end. And the quiet dignity of one 16-year-old girl would expose a culture of discrimination that had been hiding in plain sight for years. But first, Zara Johnson pressed her father's number and put the phone to her ear, her hand steady despite everything they had just put her through. The phone rang once. "Before we see how this story unfolds, tell me, have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere you had every right to be? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you believe every teenager deserves to travel with respect, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. What happens in the next 12 minutes will restore your faith in justice." Zara Johnson had been preparing for this trip her entire life, though she never could have prepared for this moment. At 16, she was already an accomplished classical pianist, spending her afternoons at the Chicago Arts Academy, where she'd earned a full scholarship based on raw talent and relentless dedication. Her small hands could make a Steinway grand sing with emotion that brought audiences to tears. Her compositions, a fusion of classical structure with contemporary soul, had already caught the attention of some of the most prestigious music schools in the country. This flight to New York was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Juilliard's pre-college program had invited her for a special audition, one that only 12 students nationwide would receive. Her portfolio contained 3 original pieces she'd spent months perfecting, each one a piece of her heart translated into notes and rhythm. She traveled alone because her father, David Johnson, was in back-to-back board meetings that he couldn't reschedule. He'd apologized a dozen times, but Zara had insisted she could handle the trip herself. "I'm 16, not 6, Dad," she'd laughed. "Besides, it's just a 3-hour flight." David had upgraded her to first class anyway, not to spoil her, but because he wanted her to arrive calm and rested for the most important audition of her young life. He'd built his aerospace empire on the principle that preparation and attention to detail mattered, and he wasn't about to let his daughter's dreams be compromised by a cramped middle seat and airplane anxiety. Zara had inherited more than her musical gifts from her grandmother's side. She'd inherited a quiet strength, a dignity that didn't need to announce itself to fill a room. Her grandmother, Maria Johnson, had been a seamstress in the 1960s who'd saved every penny to buy her granddaughter a piano. "Music is freedom," she used to say. "Nobody can take away what lives in your heart and flows through your fingers." That piano still sat in their living room, now joined by a baby grand that David had surprised Zara with for her 15th birthday. But the old upright remained her favorite scarred wood and slightly out-of-tune keys that somehow produced the most honest sound she'd ever heard. Officer Marcus Webb represented everything that Zara's family had worked generations to overcome. At 38, Webb carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd never been forced to question his own authority. 12 years with Chicago Transit Authority Airport Security had given him a badge, a uniform, and just enough power to be dangerous in the wrong hands. Webb's recent demotion still stung. 3 months ago, a complaint about excessive force during a passenger dispute had cost him his senior position and landed him back on general patrol duty. The complaint had been filed by a young Latino man who claimed Webb had used racial profiling and unnecessary physical intimidation during a security check. Though the investigation had been inconclusive, the demotion sent a clear message he was being watched. But Webb didn't see it as accountability. He saw it as persecution. In his mind, he was the victim of a structure that had gone too soft on troublemakers and problem passengers. He'd spent the last 3 months working twice as hard to prove his vigilance, building a reputation for zero tolerance and thorough passenger screening. The problem was that Webb's idea of thorough screening had a very specific pattern. Young minorities traveling alone. Passengers whose clothing didn't match his mental image of premium cabin worthy. Anyone who looked nervous, uncertain, or in his mind out of place. His supervisors praised him for maintaining cabin atmosphere and passenger comfort levels. They never asked him to explain his methods. They just looked at his numbers, removed passengers' security incidents, resolved complaints from first-class travelers down 15% since his return to active duty. Webb had convinced himself he was protecting something important. The premium experience, the natural order of things, the way it was supposed to be. Carmen Rodriguez had been with Skyward Airlines for 15 years, long enough to remember when things were different. When flight attendants were taught customer service, not customer screening. When their job was to make passengers comfortable, not to decide who deserved comfort. But the industry had changed, and Carmen had changed with it. Passenger satisfaction scores were now tied to crew bonuses. Premium cabin atmosphere ratings affected annual reviews. Management made it clear in carefully worded memos and quiet conversations that maintaining the appropriate demographic balance in first class was part of their professional responsibility. Carmen had learned to read the signs. Nervous passengers who might cause disruptions. Travelers whose appearance might make other passengers uncomfortable. Young people who might be upgrading inappropriately. The language was always coded, always careful, but the message was crystal clear. She'd flagged dozens of passengers over the years, sometimes for legitimate reasons, intoxication, aggressive behavior, valid security concerns. But increasingly, her red flags went up for subtler reasons. A gut feeling. A sense that someone didn't belong. A passenger who just didn't fit the image that management wanted to project in premium cabins. Carmen told herself she was just doing her job, following protocols, maintaining standards. She never thought of herself as discriminatory. She was Hispanic herself, after all. She was just being professional, careful, protecting the airline's reputation and her own career in an industry that didn't tolerate mistakes. The passengers filling the rest of first class represented a cross-section of American air travel privilege, each carrying their own assumptions and biases. Sarah Mitchell, 35, occupied seat 3B with her laptop open and her phone constantly in hand. As a travel blogger with over 50,000 Instagram followers, she documented everything: luxury hotels, first-class lounges, premium travel experiences that her audience lived vicariously through her posts. Sarah had built her brand on aspirational content, showing her predominantly white, affluent followers the lifestyle they dreamed of achieving. She'd noticed the commotion with interest rather than concern. Drama made for good content, and her instincts were already calculating angles and hashtags. But as Webb's words became more explicitly cruel, something shifted in her. This wasn't lifestyle content. This was something uglier, something that demanded a different kind of documentation. James Park, 29, sitting in 2C, carried professional-grade camera equipment in his overhead bag. As an independent documentary filmmaker, he'd spent the last 2 years working on a project about inequality in American transportation networks. His last film about food deserts in urban communities had premiered at Sundance and earned him enough credibility to fund his next project. James had chosen this particular flight because he'd been tracking complaints about Skyward Airline's passenger treatment policies. He'd already conducted interviews with 3 passengers who claimed they'd been discriminated against during air travel. He'd never expected to witness it happening in real time, just 2 rows in front of him. Elena Vasquez, 24, was traveling home to New York after completing her 2nd year at Northwestern Law School. Seated in 4A, she was exhausted from final exams, but alert enough to recognize what she was witnessing. Her specialty was civil rights law, and she'd spent the semester studying transportation discrimination cases. Elena knew the federal statutes Webb was violating. She recognized the airline's liability exposure. She could see the civil rights complaint taking shape in real time. But she also knew the difference between theoretical law school knowledge and real-world power dynamics. She was just a law student. Webb had a badge and institutional authority. Her options felt limited, but her legal mind was already documenting everything. Michael Torres, chapter 28, stood near the galley in his junior flight attendant uniform, watching the confrontation with growing discomfort. This was only his 2nd year with Skyward Airlines, and he'd been specifically assigned to shadow Carmen Rodriguez to learn proper passenger management techniques. But what he was witnessing didn't match anything in his training manuals. The airline's official policies emphasized respect, dignity, and customer service excellence. Yet here was his supervisor actively participating in what looked like racial profiling and passenger humiliation. Michael's phone was in his pocket, and his finger hovered over the record button. But Carmen was his direct supervisor. Webb was a federal security officer. Michael was the lowest person on the authority chain, a junior employee whose word wouldn't carry weight against established personnel. Still, something in Zara's dignified composure reminded him of his younger sister. The way she held herself straight despite the humiliation. The way she spoke quietly but clearly, never losing her composure, even as the adults around her tried to tear her down. His sister was 15, just a year younger than this girl. Michael couldn't imagine her facing this kind of treatment alone. The Boeing 737-800 had been delayed 20 minutes for what the gate agents called a routine security check. None of the passengers knew that the delay had been specifically requested by Webb, who claimed he'd noticed suspicious boarding patterns that required additional screening. The aircraft carried 287 passengers, total 118 in first class, 169 in coach. The delay meant that Captain Rodriguez and his crew were already running behind schedule, adding pressure to resolve any additional issues quickly. The business passengers in first class were checking their watches, updating calendar appointments, sending emails about delayed arrivals. None of them wanted drama. None of them wanted complications. They wanted a smooth, quiet flight where they could work, rest, or enjoy their premium experience without disturbance. That desire for normalcy, for avoiding confrontation, created the perfect environment for abuse to flourish unchallenged. The cabin itself reflected everything that airlines marketed as luxury. Cream leather seats that reclined into beds. Personal entertainment screens with noise-canceling headphones. A galley stocked with premium wines and gourmet meals. Warm lighting that created an atmosphere of exclusivity and comfort. But beneath the polished surfaces and expensive amenities lay the ugly reality that Webb and Carmen represented the belief that some people belonged in spaces like this, and others didn't. That dignity and respect were privileges to be earned rather than rights to be respected. That a 16-year-old girl's quiet presence could somehow threaten the comfort of adults who'd never questioned their own right to be anywhere they chose. In exactly 9 minutes, that ugly reality would be exposed to the world. But first, Zara Johnson was about to make a phone call that would change everything. The phone rang once before a calm, warm voice answered. "Pumpkin, did you board safely?" Even through the speaker, David Johnson's voice carried an unmistakable authority. The kind that came not from shouting or posturing, but from 20 years of building one of the most successful aerospace companies in the country. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard, respected, and taken seriously. Dad, Zara said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. "There's a problem." Webb rolled his eyes so dramatically that passengers 3 rows back could see it. "Put it on speaker, sweetheart," he said, with exaggerated patience. "Let's all hear this bedtime story." Zara hesitated for just a moment, then pressed the speaker button. David Johnson's voice filled the first-class cabin with an unexpected gravity. "What's happening, baby girl?" Before Zara could answer, Webb stepped closer, his voice carrying that particular brand of official arrogance that small amounts of power can breed. "Sir, this is Officer Marcus Webb, with Chicago Transit Authority Airport Security. Your daughter has been found in violation of passenger seating protocols and is being removed for security inconsistencies." The silence that followed was profound. Not just quiet profound the way air feels right before lightning strikes. When David spoke again, his tone had shifted. Still calm, but with an edge that made every passenger in the cabin suddenly pay attention. "Officer Webb, badge number, now." Webb blinked, caught off guard by the directness. "Excuse me. This call is being recorded." David continued his voice, carrying the measured precision of a man who'd navigated corporate boardrooms and federal contracts for decades. "You've just identified yourself as a federal security officer engaging in passenger enforcement. I need your full identification for documentation purposes." Carmen stepped forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "Sir, I'm Carmen Rodriguez, senior flight attendant. Your daughter attempted to board first class without proper verification. We're simply following standard security protocols." "Standard protocols." David repeated the phrase, hanging in the air like an accusation. "And these protocols involve publicly humiliating a minor passenger without first verifying her boarding documentation." Webb's face flushed red. He'd expected stammering pleading, maybe some angry shouting that would justify his authority. He hadn't expected calm cross-examination from someone who clearly understood both aviation law and civil rights. "Look, whoever you are," Webb said, his voice rising, "your kid tried to sneak into first class. She's been acting suspicious, avoiding questions, and now she's being difficult about compliance. We have every right to remove passengers who pose atmosphere disruption risks." "Atmosphere disruption risks?" David repeated slowly. "Officer Webb, can you explain what specific behaviors my daughter exhibited that constitute atmosphere disruption?" The question hung in the cabin air like a challenge. Around them, passengers who had been pretending not to listen were now openly staring. This wasn't the usual passenger complaint call. This felt like something much more serious. Webb looked to Carmen for support. She stepped forward, her 15 years of experience telling her to double down to maintain the narrative they'd established. "She boarded early during crew changeover," Carmen said confidently. "She avoided eye contact when approached for verification. She displayed nervous body language consistent with unauthorized access attempts. She appeared to be traveling alone without appropriate documentation review." "Appeared to be traveling alone," David said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Carmen Rodriguez, did you scan my daughter's boarding pass?" The scanner was yes or no. The simple question cut through Carmen's practiced explanation like a knife. In seat 3B, Sarah Mitchell had her phone out, but she wasn't posting to Instagram anymore. She was recording her finger hovering over the live stream button. "There were technical difficulties with yes or no," David repeated. Carmen's confident expression began to crack. "No, sir, but did you examine her government-issued identification? Security protocols dictate that yes or no." The silence stretched until it became unbearable. "No, sir." James Park, 2 rows behind the confrontation, had his professional camera out now, its red recording light barely visible. As a documentary filmmaker, he recognized history happening in real time. This wasn't just passenger drama, this was evidence. Webb, sensing Carmen's foundation crumbling, stepped back in aggressively. Listen here, pal. I don't know who you think you are, but I've got 12 years of experience identifying problem passengers. Your kid fits the profile exactly. Young, alone, nervous, trying to access premium services without proper verification. I've seen this scam 1,000 times. The profile, David said softly. Officer Webb, can you describe this profile for me? You know exactly what I mean, Webb snapped. Don't try to make this about something it's not. I'm asking you to specify the behavioral indicators that led to your security assessment. Webb's jaw clenched. He was being backed into a corner by questions he couldn't answer honestly without exposing the ugly truth of his methods. Kids like her. Kids like her. You're trying to twist my words. I'm asking you to explain your words. Elena Vasquez in seat 4A was typing frantically on her phone, documenting every exchange. As a second-year law student specializing in civil rights, she could see the case building in real time. Unlawful detention, racial profiling, violation of federal transportation, anti-discrimination statutes. But she could also see something else, a masterclass in how power and privilege operated when challenged properly. Michael Torres stood frozen near the galley, his junior flight attendant uniform feeling like a costume he'd borrowed from someone else's life. His finger was still hovering over his phone's record button, torn between self-preservation and doing what he knew was right. Webb tried a different approach, his voice taking on the tone he used with his supervisors. Reasonable professional, just a working man trying to do his job. Sir, your daughter has been uncooperative with standard verification procedures. She claimed to have valid documentation, but became defensive when asked to present it. In my experience, legitimate passengers are eager to comply with security measures. Uncooperative, David said. Zara, did Officer Webb ask to see your boarding pass? Zara's voice quiet but clear. No, sir. He told me to get up because I didn't belong here. Did he ask for identification? No, sir. Ms. Rodriguez said she had asked me earlier, but she walked away before I could respond. Were you given an opportunity to present your boarding documentation before being told you were being removed? No, sir. Webb's face was now deep red, a combination of anger and embarrassment. She's obviously coaching her to say, Officer Webb! David interrupted, his voice cutting through the cabin like a blade. Are you suggesting that I'm instructing my daughter to lie about events that occurred in the presence of 42 witnesses? For the first time, Webb looked around the cabin and seemed to realize that every single passenger was watching, listening, many of them recording. The business executive in 4C had his phone pointed directly at Webb. The elderly couple in 3C were whispering urgently to each other. The mother traveling with her teenage daughter was staring at Zara with the expression of horror and recognition. Carmen tried to regain control of the situation. Sir, airline personnel have broad discretionary authority to maintain cabin safety and passenger comfort. If we determine that a passenger's presence is creating tension or disruption. Whose comfort was being disrupted? David asked quietly. The question hit the cabin like a physical blow. Carmen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around, desperately searching for an answer that wouldn't expose the truth. The other first-class passengers expect a certain level of what Carmen was trapped, and she knew it. Any answer she gave would damn her. She couldn't say a certain level of exclusivity without admitting to discrimination. She couldn't claim passenger complaints because none had been made. She couldn't reference legitimate security concerns because none existed. Sarah Mitchell made her decision. She pressed the live stream button on her Instagram account and held up her phone. This is Sarah Mitchell reporting live from Skyward Airlines Flight 318, she said quietly. I'm witnessing what appears to be racial profiling of a minor passenger in real time. Her follower count started climbing immediately. 3,000 viewers, 5,000, 8,000. The comments were pouring in faster than she could read them, but the tone was unmistakable outrage. James Park had switched from his professional camera to his phone, uploading clips to TikTok with hashtags Skyward Scandal, Justice for Zara, Flight 318 Truth. The first video gained 50,000 views in 6 minutes. Webb, realizing he was losing control of the narrative, played his final card: intimidation. "You know what, friend," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "I think you and your daughter are running a scam here, probably trying to set up the airline for a discrimination lawsuit. Create a scene, record everything, then sue for damages. I've seen it before." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. But instead of the defensive anger, Webb expected David Johnson's voice came back calm as steel. "Officer Webb, you've just accused me and my minor daughter of criminal fraud on a recorded line in the presence of multiple witnesses. Are you prepared to state that accusation formally?" Webb's confidence cracked. This wasn't how these confrontations were supposed to go. The passenger was supposed to get angry, defensive, maybe take a swing at him. That would justify everything. The removal, the aggression, the assumptions. But this calm, measured response was dismantling his authority piece by piece. "I'm saying," Webb stammered, "that your daughter doesn't belong in first class, and you're making this about something it's not." "Doesn't belong?" David repeated. "Based on what criteria? She doesn't—" "Complete your sentence, Officer Webb." The silence that followed was deafening. Every passenger in first class could hear Webb's breathing, could see his hands shaking slightly with rage and frustration. He'd been backed into a corner where the only honest answer would expose his prejudices for what they really were. Elena Vasquez looked up from her phone, where she'd been documenting every word. Her legal training told her they were witnessing more than passenger mistreatment. They were seeing institutional bias exposed in real time. Michael Torres finally made his choice. His finger found the record button on his phone. As a junior employee, his testimony might not carry much weight, but it would be evidence. Proof of what the airline knew, what they taught, how they really operated when they thought nobody was watching. In exactly 6 minutes, everything would change. But first, David Johnson was about to ask the question that would bring down not just Webb and Carmen, but the entire structure of discrimination they represented. "Officer Webb," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd spent 2 decades building aircraft engines for the world's most demanding airlines. "Let me ask you one final question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer." The cabin held its breath. "If my daughter were white, would we be having this conversation?" The question detonated like a bomb in the pressurized cabin. Webb's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Carmen stepped backward, as if she'd been physically struck. Around them, passengers stared in stunned silence, the ugly truth finally spoken aloud. Sarah Mitchell's live stream had reached 47,000 viewers. The comments were flooding in so fast they blurred together. "This is disgusting. Someone needs to stop this. Where is the captain? This can't be legal." James Park's TikTok videos were exploding across social media. Skyward Scandal was beginning to trend. Justice for Zara was gaining momentum. Teen activists were sharing the clips faster than the platform could track. But inside the cabin of Flight 318 time seemed suspended in that moment after David Johnson's question. Because everyone passenger's crew security knew the answer. They all knew exactly what was happening. They all knew it was wrong, and they all knew that in about 5 minutes the man on the phone was going to do something about it. Webb's face cycled through expressions like a malfunctioning traffic light, red with anger, pale with realization, red again with desperate fury. David Johnson's question hung in the cabin air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back or ignored. That's not... You're trying to make this about race when it's about security protocols." Webb finally managed, his voice cracking under the weight of a lie he couldn't quite sell to himself anymore. "Security protocols?" David repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. Officer Webb, I need your badge number, now. You don't get to demand badge number, now. The authority in David's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a request from a concerned parent. This was a command from someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone whose words carried consequences that extended far beyond this aircraft cabin. Webb's hand moved unconsciously to his badge, then stopped. "Who are you?" he asked, the question coming out smaller than he'd intended. "Badge number." David repeated a third time. Carmen stepped forward, trying to regain some control of a situation that was spiraling beyond her experience. "Sir, we appreciate your concern, but airline personnel don't answer to passenger demands. We have protocols to follow, and Carmen Rodriguez—" David interrupted his voice, cutting through her prepared speech like a scalpel. 15 years with Skyward Airlines, employee ID 44827, based out of Chicago O'Hare, 3 commendations for customer service. 2 complaints filed in the last 18 months, both dismissed after internal review. The silence that followed was absolute. Carmen's face went white. Webb took a step backward, his confidence evaporating like steam. "How do you—" Carmen whispered. "Zara," David said gently, his voice softening when he addressed his daughter. "Are you hurt? Did either of these individuals lay hands on you?" "No, Dad." Officer Webb reached toward me, but I moved away. "Good girl." His voice hardened again. "Officer Webb, did you make physical contact with my minor daughter without her consent?" Webb's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "I was just— Standard passenger compliance procedures allow for yes or no. I barely touched yes or no. This is ridiculous. I'm a federal security officer conducting legitimate—" David's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow every passenger in first class heard every word. "Officer Webb, I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you make unauthorized physical contact with my 16-year-old daughter Sarah Mitchell's livestream had reached 78,000 viewers?" The comments were scrolling so fast, they were just a blur of outrage and disbelief. She could see news organizations starting to pick up the story in real time, local Chicago news aviation blogs, civil rights organizations. James Park was filming with both his professional camera and his phone, now uploading to multiple platforms simultaneously. His documentary training told him this was the moment before everything exploded, the calm before the storm that would reshape how this entire incident was remembered. Elena Vasquez had stopped taking notes and was now live tweeting the encounter to her law school classmates and professors. Her civil rights law professor had already retweeted her thread to his 15,000 followers. Legal experts were beginning to weigh in on potential federal violations. But inside the cabin, the focus had narrowed to a single point of tension between an increasingly desperate security officer and a voice on a phone that somehow commanded more authority than a badge and a uniform. Webb tried one last time to assert control. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know how to spot trouble, and your daughter, my daughter, what? She just— Look at her. She doesn't look like she belongs in first class." The words escaped before Webb could stop them, hanging in the air like a confession. Around the cabin, passengers gasped. Sarah Mitchell's livestream exploded with comments. Elena Vasquez looked up from her phone, her legal mind cataloging the admission that had just been made on video. "Doesn't look like she belongs," David repeated slowly. "Officer Webb, can you explain what someone who belongs in first class looks like?" Webb realized his mistake immediately. But it was too late. The words were out there, recorded, witnessed, documented. "I didn't mean— That's not what I—" "What did you mean I meant? She's young, and young people don't belong in first class." "No, that's not—" "She's traveling alone? Unaccompanied minors don't belong in first class." Webb was drowning each question, pushing him deeper underwater. "She just seems out of place." Out of place, how Carmen tried to throw him a lifeline. "Sir, we're simply following standard passenger screening procedures." Sometimes passengers attempt to access premium cabins without proper authorization and— Did you scan her boarding pass? David asked. The equipment was yes or no. No, but did you verify her identification? There were extenuating circumstances, yes or no? No. Did you follow any standard verification procedure before determining she didn't belong in first class? Carmen's 15 years of experience were crumbling around her. No, sir. Michael Torres, standing near the galley with his phone recording everything, watched his supervisor's career implode in real time. The training materials he'd studied, the policies he'd memorized, the customer service standards the airline claimed to uphold, none of it matched what he was witnessing. Officer Webb. David continued, his voice taking on a tone that made several passengers straighten in their seats. What is your badge number? I don't have to give you badge number. Webb looked around the cabin, desperately searching for support, for backup, for someone to validate his authority. But every face staring back at him reflected the same thing: judgment. 42 passengers who had watched him humiliate a 16-year-old girl without cause, without justification, without basic human decency. 7749, he whispered. Officer Marcus Webb, badge number 7749, Chicago Transit Authority, Airport Security, assigned to Skyward Airlines Gate Security Detail. Is this correct? How do you know all this? Webb asked, his voice cracking with fear for the first time. Zara, David said gently, I need you to stay calm for just a few more minutes, okay? Daddy's going to fix this. Okay, Dad. Officer Webb. Rodriguez, you've just admitted to detaining a minor passenger without following standard verification procedures based solely on your subjective assessment of whether she looked like she belonged in first class. Is this an accurate summary? Neither Webb nor Carmen answered. They couldn't. Any answer would be an admission of guilt. I'm going to give you both one opportunity to apologize to my daughter and return to your duties, David said. This is not a negotiation. This is me offering you a chance to minimize the consequences of your actions. Webb's desperation morphed back into anger. You can't threaten a federal officer. I don't care who you think you are. Who I think I am. David's voice carried a note of grim amusement. Officer Webb, do you know what aircraft you're currently standing in? Webb blinked, confused by the question. It's a Boeing 737, Boeing 737-800 series, powered by CFM56-7B engines. Do you know who manufactures those engines, Officer Webb? A cold realization began to dawn on Webb's face. Carmen took a step backward, her expression shifting from defiance to horror. The CFM56 series is manufactured through a joint partnership between General Electric and Safran Aircraft Engines. David continued, his voice carrying the precision of a man discussing his life's work. The specific variant powering this aircraft, the CFM56-7B27, is assembled at a facility in Johnson City, Tennessee. Webb's face went gray. Johnson City. Johnson Aerospace Industries, David said quietly. Founded in 2003, primary contractor for commercial aircraft engine assembly and maintenance for 17 major airlines, including Skyward Airlines. The cabin was dead silent. Passengers held their breath, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. My name is David Johnson, he continued, Chairman and CEO of Johnson Aerospace Industries. Skyward Airlines operates 847 aircraft, 312 of which are powered by engines manufactured by my company. Our contract with Skyward represents approximately $2.8 billion in annual revenue. Carmen made a sound like air escaping from a punctured balloon. Officer Webb David said, his voice now carrying the quiet authority of a man who could ground an entire airline with a single phone call. You are currently standing in an aircraft powered by engines built by my company. harassing my daughter on an airline that depends on my company for 37% of its fleet operations. Webb's knees looked like they might buckle. Carmen was gripping the seat back in front of her for support. "This aircraft will not depart," David said simply. "This flight is cancelled, effective immediately." And that's when everything changed. The 3 words hit the cabin like a physical force. "This flight is cancelled." For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The impossible had just happened. A passenger had cancelled a flight from his phone, sitting in a boardroom 300 miles away with the calm authority of someone announcing the weather. Then chaos erupted. "Wait," what the businessman in 4C called out. "He can't just cancel a flight!" Webb protested, his voice cracking with desperation and disbelief. But even as he spoke, the intercom crackled to life. Captain Rodriguez's voice, tense and professional, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to operational requirements, Flight 318 to LaGuardia has been cancelled. We apologize for the inconvenience and are returning to the gate immediately. Please remain seated while we coordinate with ground operations." The cabin exploded in voices, passengers calling out questions, phones ringing the sounds of confusion and growing outrage. But beneath it all, David Johnson's voice continued calm and implacable. "Officer Webb, you have 30 seconds to remove yourself from this aircraft before Airport Authority and Federal Transportation Security arrive to escort you off." Webb looked around, desperately searching for someone to tell him this wasn't happening, that a passenger couldn't just ground a commercial flight with a phone call. But Carmen had backed away from him, her face white with terror as she realized the magnitude of what they'd done. "You can't... This isn't..." Webb stammered. Sarah Mitchell's live stream had exploded past 200,000 viewers. The comments were pouring in so fast her phone could barely keep up. News outlets were picking up the stream, embedding it in breaking news articles, sharing it across social media platforms. "This is unprecedented," she told her viewers, her voice hushed with awe. "A CEO just cancelled an entire commercial flight because of discrimination against his daughter. This is history happening live." James Park was uploading video to every platform he could access. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, his professional networks. The hashtags "Skyward Cancelled Justice for Zara Power Meets Privilege" were trending nationally within minutes. Elena Vasquez had given up trying to document everything, and was now just watching in stunned amazement as corporate power was wielded like a sword of justice. Her professors had talked about theoretical applications of economic leverage in civil rights cases, but she'd never seen it deployed in real time with surgical precision. Mr. Johnson, Carmen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, sir, I've worked for this airline for 15 years. I have a daughter. I was just following what David's voice cut through her plea like ice. Following procedures that don't exist. Following training that taught you to profile 16-year-old passengers. Following instincts that told you my daughter didn't deserve basic human dignity." Carmen burst into tears, great heaving sobs that echoed through the first-class cabin. 15 years of career advancement, pension benefits, health insurance, job security, all of it evaporating in real time. Michael Torres stepped forward from the galley, his junior flight attendant uniform suddenly feeling like a target on his back. "Sir," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I recorded this entire incident. Ms. Rodriguez and Officer Webb, what they did, it's not what we were taught. It's not company policy." David's voice softened slightly. "What's your name, son?" "Michael Torres, sir." "Junior flight attendant." "Michael, I want you to know that your honesty today will be remembered. You chose to do the right thing when it mattered." Webb made one last desperate attempt to salvage his authority. "This is insane. You can't destroy people's careers because you don't like security protocols. I was doing my job." "Your job?" David repeated. "Officer Webb, Your job is to ensure passenger safety and security compliance. Can you explain how humiliating my daughter contributed to either of those objectives? She was. Answer the question. How did your behavior enhance security? Webb's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Because there was no answer. There had never been a security concern. There had never been a legitimate reason for the confrontation. There had only been prejudice and the abuse of power. Around them, passengers were starting to understand the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. The elderly couple in 3C were whispering urgently to each other. The mother traveling with her teenage daughter was staring at Zara with a mixture of horror and admiration. The business travelers were frantically texting, calling rescheduling meetings. "Airport authority is boarding now," David's voice continued. "Officer Webb, you will be escorted off this aircraft and suspended pending investigation. Ms. Rodriguez, you are terminated effective immediately. All passengers will be reaccommodated on other flights with full compensation." Through the aircraft windows, passengers could see vehicles approaching airport security. Federal transportation officials' news vans already pulling up to the gate. The story was breaking in real time across every major news platform. Webb's radio crackled, his supervisor's voice tight with anxiety. "Webb, report to terminal security immediately. Do not speak to any media. Do not make any statements." So Webb said into his radio, his voice hollow, "I think I need a lawyer." Carmen was still sobbing, clutching her phone as she tried to call her husband, her supervisor. Anyone who could tell her this was all a nightmare that she'd wake up from. But the phone call that had started this chain reaction was still connected. David Johnson's voice still clear and calm. "Zara," he said gently. "Are you okay, baby girl?" For the first time since the ordeal began, Zara's composure cracked. "Yes, Daddy," she whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I just want to come home." "You're going to make it to your audition," David said firmly. "I'm chartering a private jet. It'll be there in 2 hours. And when you play for those judges, you're going to play like the strong, dignified young woman you showed everyone on that plane today." Around the cabin, passengers were crying not from sadness, but from the raw emotion of witnessing justice delivered with surgical precision. The businessman in 4C was applauding slowly. Other passengers joined in a wave of approval rippling through first class. Webb stood frozen as airport authority officers boarded the aircraft. 3 officers in Federal Transportation Security uniforms, 2 airport police supervisors, and a woman in a business suit who identified herself as the Federal Aviation Administration's Regional Civil Rights Compliance Officer. "Officer Marcus Webb?" the lead officer asked. "Yes, sir. You're suspended from duty pending investigation into civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and potential federal discrimination charges. Please come with us." As they escorted Webb down the aisle, passengers watched in silence. Some filmed his departure. Others simply stared at the man who had tried to destroy a 16-year-old girl's dignity and instead had his own world collapse around him. Carmen was gathering her things with shaking hands, her 15-year career ending not with recognition or retirement, but with humiliation and termination. Michael Torres watched his supervisor pack up her life in a plastic bag, understanding that his own career trajectory had just changed completely. "Ms. Rodriguez, the FAA compliance officer, said you'll need to come with us as well. There will be an investigation into the airline's training protocols and your role in this incident." But David Johnson wasn't finished. Before you leave, his voice carried clearly through the cabin speakers, "I want everyone on this aircraft to understand something. What happened here today wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, a culture, a structure that allowed 2 adults to humiliate a child because they decided she didn't look like she belonged." The cabin was completely silent now. "My daughter will recover from this experience. She's strong and she has a family that loves her. But how many other children have sat in seats like this facing people like Officer Webb and Ms. Rodriguez without anyone to call. How many other parents have sent their children into the world, believing they would be treated with basic human dignity, only to have that faith shattered by adults who see skin color before they see humanity? Sarah Mitchell's live stream had reached 400,000 viewers. The comments were no longer just outrage, they were testimonials. Hundreds of people sharing their own experiences of discrimination in airports, on planes, in spaces where they were told they didn't belong. This aircraft will not fly again until every employee responsible for creating this culture is identified and removed. David continued. This airline will not receive another dollar of revenue from my company until they demonstrate meaningful change, and this industry will be held accountable for turning basic human dignity into a privilege that has to be earned. The federal officers were documenting everything. Badge numbers, employee IDs, passenger statements, video evidence from multiple sources. Elena Vasquez volunteered her law school notes and legal analysis. James Park provided his professional documentation. Sarah Mitchell shared her live stream data. But the most powerful evidence was Zara herself, a 16-year-old girl who had maintained her dignity in the face of adult cruelty, who had trusted her father to protect her, who had shown more grace under pressure than the adults who had tried to break her spirit. As the last officials left the aircraft and passengers began gathering their belongings, David's voice came through one final time. Zara, I'm proud of you. Not just for how you handled this, but for who you are. You're going to change the world, baby girl, starting with that audition. The plane was nearly empty now, just a few passengers and the remaining crew. Zara sat in seat 1A, the seat she'd been told she didn't deserve, the seat that had become the center of a storm that would reshape how airlines treated passengers, how security operated, how power was held accountable. In 2 hours, she'd board a private jet to New York. In 4 hours, she'd be at Juilliard, playing her heart out for judges who would see her talent before they saw anything else. But right now, she was just a 16-year-old girl who had learned that sometimes when the world tries to make you small, the people who love you make sure you remember exactly how big you really are. The story broke nationally before Flight 318 had even returned to the gate. Within 30 minutes of David Johnson's phone call, CEO cancels flight was trending on every major social media platform. By the time passengers were disembarking, CNN had interrupted regular programming for breaking news coverage. The video clips that Sarah Mitchell and James Park had uploaded were being shared faster than the platforms could track engagement. But the real earthquake was happening behind the scenes in boardrooms and federal offices where David Johnson's name carried weight that extended far beyond viral videos and social media outrage. FBI Special Agent Patricia Williams received the call at 3:47 p.m. "Pat, we need the Civil Rights Division involved immediately," the voice on the other end said. "This isn't just passenger mistreatment. This looks like institutional discrimination with federal aviation security involvement." Within 2 hours, the Department of Justice had opened a preliminary investigation into patterns of discrimination in commercial aviation. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an immediate audit of Skyward Airlines' passenger treatment protocols. The Transportation Security Administration began reviewing Officer Webb's employment history and any previous complaints, but the most devastating blow came from David Johnson himself, delivered with the same calm precision he'd shown during the phone call. At 5:15 p.m., Johnson Aerospace Industries released a statement that sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. Effective immediately, Johnson Aerospace Industries is suspending all maintenance and parts supply contracts with Skyward Airlines pending a comprehensive review of their passenger treatment policies and employee training protocols. This suspension affects 312 aircraft and represents approximately $2.8 billion in annual contract value. The stock market responded instantly. Skyward Airlines' share price dropped 34% in after-hours trading. Emergency board meetings were called. Major investors demanded explanations. Competitor airlines began publicly reviewing their own policies, desperate to avoid similar exposure. Meanwhile, in a conference room at Chicago O'Hare Airport, authority investigators were beginning to uncover the full scope of what Webb and Carmen had revealed. "Show me the passenger removal statistics for the last 24 months, lead investigator Captain Sarah Davis demanded. Broken down by race, age, and cabin class. The numbers were damning. In first class, 73% of passengers removed for security concerns were minorities. Of those, 89% were later found to have valid boarding passes and proper identification. The pattern was so clear, so consistent, that it couldn't be explained by anything other than deliberate bias. Officer Webb's personnel file revealed even more troubling details. 12 formal complaints over 6 years, most of them dismissed after cursory internal reviews. 3 lawsuits filed against the Chicago Transit Authority for excessive force and discriminatory enforcement, all settled quietly out of court. A pattern of targeting young minorities, women traveling alone, and passengers whose appearance didn't match his mental image of premium cabin appropriate. Carmen Rodriguez's employment records showed a similar trajectory. Passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment had increased 200% since her promotion to senior flight attendant. Her crew had the highest rate of passenger removals in the airline's Chicago operations. Yet she'd received 3 performance bonuses for maintaining premium cabin atmosphere standards. The investigation revealed training materials that made the discrimination explicit without ever stating it directly. Phrases like maintaining demographic balance and ensuring passenger comfort levels were code for racial profiling. Crew members were taught to identify atmosphere disruptors based on subjective criteria that inevitably targeted minorities. Michael Torres, the junior flight attendant who had recorded the incident, provided investigators with audio evidence of supervisory conversations that exposed the culture completely. Carmen told us in training that first-class passengers expect a certain look in their cabin, he testified. She said our job was to screen out passengers who might make premium customers uncomfortable. She never said it was about race directly, but the examples she gave. They were all about young black passengers, Hispanic families, anyone who looked out of place in her words. The recordings revealed a quota pattern that went far beyond individual bias. Crew members who removed problem passengers received better scheduling, preferred route assignments, and performance bonuses. Those who failed to maintain standards were passed over for promotions and given less desirable flights. Federal investigators discovered that the discrimination wasn't limited to Skyward Airlines. A comprehensive review of transportation security data revealed similar patterns at airports across the country. Young minorities were stopped, searched, and removed at rates far exceeding their percentage of the traveling population. But the most explosive revelation came from a former Skyward Airlines manager who had quit 6 months earlier over what she called unethical passenger policies. Linda Martinez had been Regional Passenger Services Director for 3 years before resigning in disgust. She provided investigators with internal emails, training documents, and recordings that exposed the full scope of the cover-up. We had unofficial metrics for premium cabin maintenance, she testified under oath. Crew members were evaluated partly on their ability to minimize complaints from high-value passengers. Management made it clear that high-value passengers expected a certain demographic environment, and our job was to maintain it. The emails were devastating. Regional managers discussing problem demographics and strategies for discouraging inappropriate upgrades. Training directors sharing best practices for passenger atmosphere management that were clearly racial profiling disguised as customer service. Most damaging of all were the recordings of management meetings where executives openly discussed the need to maintain the exclusivity appeal of premium cabins by ensuring appropriate passenger selection. "We're not running a public bus," one regional vice president was recorded saying. Premium passengers pay for an experience, and part of that experience is feeling like they're in an elevated environment. Our crew needs to understand their role in maintaining that standard. The financial consequences cascaded through the industry like a tsunami. By the end of the week, Skyward Airlines faced federal fines that could exceed $200 million. Class action lawsuits were filed by civil rights organizations on behalf of hundreds of passengers who had experienced similar discrimination. Congressional hearings were announced to investigate industry-wide patterns of bias. But the human cost was equally devastating. Webb lost his federal security clearance and faced criminal charges for civil rights violations. Carmen was not only terminated but blacklisted from employment with any airline. 3 regional managers were fired. The regional vice president, whose comments were recorded, was forced to resign. Yet the real transformation began with the reforms that David Johnson's company helped design and implement. The Johnson Protocol became the industry standard for anti-discrimination training and passenger treatment. Every airline employee, from security officers to senior management, was required to complete comprehensive bias awareness education. Passenger removal decisions required supervisor approval and documented justification. All discrimination complaints were reviewed by independent external boards. Johnson Aerospace Industries developed an AI-powered monitoring framework that analyzed passenger treatment data in real time, flagging potential discrimination patterns before they could become entrenched. The framework tracked removal rates by demographic identified crew members with suspicious statistics and required immediate intervention when bias patterns emerged. Other airlines rushed to adopt similar frameworks, desperate to avoid the financial and reputational disaster that had engulfed Skyward. Premium cabin policies were rewritten to focus on behavior rather than appearance. Training programs were overhauled to emphasize dignity and respect for all passengers. The technology sector responded as well. Within 6 months, 3 major companies had developed apps that allowed passengers to report discrimination in real time with automatic alerts to civil rights organizations and regulatory agencies. These tools gave travelers the power to document and expose bias before it could be hidden or ignored. Media coverage sustained public attention long enough to force lasting change. James Park's documentary, 35,000 Feet Discrimination in the Clouds, premiered at Sundance and won the Audience Award for social impact. Sarah Mitchell used her platform to interview dozens of passengers who had experienced similar treatment, keeping the story alive across multiple news cycles. The legal precedents established by the Johnson case reshaped transportation law. Federal courts ruled that airlines could not remove passengers based on subjective comfort standards that disproportionately affected minorities. The burden of proof shifted to airlines to demonstrate legitimate security concerns rather than relying on officer discretion. Most importantly, the changes extended beyond aviation. Hotels, rental car companies, and other service industries faced new scrutiny and accountability measures. The idea that customer service could mask discrimination was challenged across sectors, forcing comprehensive policy reforms and cultural shifts. But perhaps the most powerful outcome was the message sent to every child who had ever been told they didn't belong somewhere they had every right to be. Zara Johnson's dignity under pressure had exposed a network of institutional bias and triggered reforms that would protect millions of future travelers. The airline industry would never be the same. Power had met justice, and justice had won. 3 weeks later, Zara Johnson walked through the same terminal at Chicago O'Hare, carrying the same worn leather portfolio, wearing the same quiet confidence that had sustained her through the ordeal that changed everything. But the airport felt different now, not just because of the new signs posted throughout the terminals. Dignity is not a privilege. It's a right. David Johnson. Johnson Aerospace Industries. But because something fundamental had shifted in the air itself. The TSA agents who greeted her at security weren't performing customer service. They were demonstrating genuine respect. The gate agents weren't checking her boarding pass with suspicion. They were welcoming her as a valued passenger. The transformation wasn't cosmetic, it was cultural. Miss Johnson, the young agent at the Skyward Airlines counter, said, with a warm smile, "We're honored to have you flying with us today. Your father asked us to ensure you receive our highest level of service." Zara smiled back, but gently corrected him. "I appreciate the kindness, but I don't need special treatment. I just need to be treated like any other passenger." The agent nodded, understanding immediately. "Of course. You have a confirmed seat in first class to LaGuardia. Your boarding group will be called in about 20 minutes. As Zara found a seat at the gate, she reflected on the weeks since the incident. The private jet her father had chartered had gotten her to New York just in time for her Juilliard audition. She'd played better than ever before, not despite what had happened on the plane, but because of it. The music had flowed from somewhere deeper than technique, from a place where dignity and strength had fused into something unbreakable. She'd been accepted, of course. Full scholarship with a personal note from the dean, praising not just her musical ability, but her character under pressure. The video of her maintaining composure while adults tried to humiliate her had reached the admissions committee, adding context to her audition that transcended any written application. The scholarship had been named in her honor, the Zara Johnson Dignity in Arts Fellowship, designed specifically for talented young people who had overcome discrimination or adversity. The first recipient would be announced next month, a 17-year-old violinist from rural Alabama whose family had been told she was too poor and too black to pursue classical music seriously. But the personal victories, meaningful as they were, paled beside the broader changes that had rippled outward from that cancelled flight. Michael Torres approached her gate, wearing the uniform of a Skyward Airlines crew supervisor. The airline had promoted him after his courage during the investigation, recognizing that the future of customer service lay with employees who understood justice as well as hospitality. "Miss Johnson," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you. Thank me for staying calm that day, for showing the rest of us what dignity looks like under pressure. I've been training new crew members, and we use your example, not what you endured, but how you responded, as the standard for treating passengers with respect." Zara studied his face, seeing genuine transformation rather than corporate politeness. "Mr. Torres, you chose to do the right thing when it mattered. That took courage, too." "It took your courage first," he replied. "I just followed your lead." As boarding began, Zara made her way to seat 1A, the same seat she'd occupied 3 weeks earlier. But this time, the flight attendant greeting passengers was a new face, a young woman whose training had emphasized dignity, respect, and the recognition that every passenger deserved to feel welcome. "Welcome aboard, Miss Johnson," she said with genuine warmth. "I'm Maria Santos, your lead flight attendant today. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to make your flight comfortable." Zara settled into her seat and pulled out her phone to text her father. "Boarding now. No drama, no problems, just normal travel like it should be." His response came immediately. "Proud of you every day. Play beautifully in New York. Love you, baby girl." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Zara looked around the cabin at her fellow passengers, a diverse group of travelers, each treated with the same courtesy and respect, regardless of age, race, or appearance. This was how air travel was supposed to work. This was the standard that should have existed all along. The plane lifted off smoothly, climbing through the afternoon sky toward New York and Zara's future at Juilliard. But her thoughts weren't on personal success. They were on the letter she'd received yesterday from a 13-year-old girl in Atlanta. "Dear Miss Johnson," it had read, "I saw the video of what happened to you on the airplane. My mum and I were scared to fly to visit my grandmother because last time the airline people were mean to us and said we probably had fake tickets. But after seeing how you handled those bullies, we decided to try again. They treated us nice this time. Thank you for being brave so people like me could feel safe too." Similar letters arrived almost daily from parents who felt comfortable sending their children on solo flights, from teenagers who no longer feared being questioned about their right to occupy the spaces they'd paid for, from families who could travel without anxiety about being profiled or humiliated. The changes had been swift and comprehensive. The Johnson Protocol was now federal law for all commercial airlines. Discrimination complaints were handled by independent review boards with real enforcement power. Employee training emphasized cultural competency and bias recognition. Most importantly, passengers had new rights and new ways to report violations in real time. But the deeper transformation was cultural. Children grew up seeing Zara's story as proof that dignity could triumph over prejudice, that standing up for what was right could create change, that their voices mattered, regardless of their age or appearance. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Zara opened her portfolio and reviewed the pieces she would perform in New York, not just for her classes, but for a special concert dedicated to young artists who had overcome adversity. The final piece was her own composition, written during the weeks following the flight, Quiet Strength, Loud Justice. The music began softly, almost hesitantly, like a young voice finding its courage. It built, gradually incorporating themes of challenge and confrontation, but always returning to a melody that spoke of unquackable inner dignity. The piece concluded not with triumphant fanfare, but with a gentle, powerful statement that resonated long after the final notes faded. It was, she realized, the musical version of what had happened on Flight 318, not a story about revenge or victory over enemies, but about maintaining your essential self when the world tries to diminish you. About finding strength in truth rather than volume, about understanding that real power comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Officer Webb had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for civil rights violations with mandatory community service upon release. He would spend the remainder of his sentence working with civil rights organizations, learning about the communities he had targeted. Carmen Rodriguez had lost her airline career, but found new purpose as a diversity trainer, dedicating her remaining professional years to educating others about the consequences of bias. Both had written letters of apology to Zara, not legal documents crafted by attorneys, but personal admissions of guilt and pledges to do better. Zara had responded to both not with forgiveness exactly, but with hope that their experience would help them become better people. The real legacy wasn't punishment or retribution, it was transformation. An industry forced to confront its biases. Employees trained to see passengers as human beings worthy of dignity. Children growing up with the knowledge that their presence in any space was valid and valuable. Parents able to send their kids into the world with confidence that frameworks existed to protect rather than profile them. As the plane began its descent into LaGuardia, Zara reflected on how much had changed in 3 weeks. She was still the same 16-year-old who loved music and dreamed of performing on stages around the world. But she was also something more, now a symbol of the power that comes from refusing to accept unacceptable treatment, a reminder that courage sometimes speaks in quiet voices, an example of how individual dignity can reshape entire networks. The aircraft touched down smoothly, and as passengers gathered their belongings, several approached Zara with words of encouragement and recognition, not as celebrity worship, but as appreciation for someone who had stood up when standing up mattered. Zara deplaned with the same quiet confidence she'd carried onto Flight 318. But now that confidence was grounded in the knowledge that dignity wasn't something others could take from you, it was something you carried within yourself, regardless of how others chose to behave. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "How was the flight?" She smiled as she typed back, "Perfect. Just like every flight should be." Dignity isn't something you wear or earn or prove. It's something you are. Justice isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's a 16-year-old girl refusing to move from a seat she rightfully occupied, trusting that truth and courage would be enough. Sometimes it's a father using his power to protect rather than dominate. Sometimes it's a structure finally listening to voices it had tried to silence. This story reminds us that change is possible when we refuse to accept injustice as normal, when we speak up for what's right, even when our voices shake. When we remember that every person deserves to move through the world with their dignity intact. If this story moved you, I want to ask you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button to help more people see this story of courage and justice. Second, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss stories that matter, stories that inspire, stories that remind us of our shared humanity. And third, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe a young person who's been told they don't belong. Maybe a parent sending their child into the world. Maybe someone who's forgotten that their voice has power. Your seat at the table on the plane in the world isn't a privilege someone else grants you. It's a birthright you were born with, and no one has the right to make you prove you deserve it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being part of a community that believes dignity and justice aren't just ideals, they're choices we make every single day.